I'm particularly thrilled to have the opportunity to welcome our guest speaker, Eliana Fisher, who I believe is originally from Wilmette, Illinois, which is in the greater Chicago area. So, ladies and gentlemen, let's just begin with the following premise that we know that we are coming up to Martin Luther King Day, which gives us heightened sensibilities, perhaps, to taking care of those who are disenfranchised within our society. Now, I want to make note that we'll be speaking today specifically about addressing issues regarding people with disabilities, which is an area in which Eliana has a great expertise. You may be asking yourself the question, well, why aren't we speaking about Black-Jewish relations? And that would be a fair question. I would like to just make a quick comment that over the last few months, if nothing else, there has been not only a critical silence for the Black community in our country, but even more so, standing on the other side of the issue that confronts us as Jewish people. So I want to put that just in perspective to say, so maybe it's too sensitive a topic for us to address now, but nonetheless, we still, in the spirit of MLK, and he was, if you recall, he was murdered April 4, 1960. If you recall, the Jewish leaders were at the forefront of supporting the cause of equality for the African American community in this country. And in fact, what is not known is that MLK was actually, it was 8 days before Pesach. He had been in the South, and he was actually on his way to celebrate a Seder with Abraham Joshua Heschel when he was unfortunately murdered. So in any event, I think whether or not we're discussing issues of race or issues of people being disenfranchised, those who are disabled, etc., that it is the case that Jewish tradition pushes us always to awaken our consciousness towards those less protected in our society. And in fact, the mitzvah in the Torah that is repeated more than any mitzvah is the mitzvah of taking care of those who are less powerful in your society. So I had the opportunity to discuss with Eliana a lot of the work that she does. She was kind enough to share with me a beautiful paper that she wrote. And what I want us to do is sort of have an insight into what it means to take care of people with disabilities. What are some of the obstacles that they face? So Eliana, whose parents may or may not be online, if they are, shalom. they are both physicians. And can you describe to our friends that when somebody wants to be qualified, if you will, to be disabled, can you explain to our friends here today, what does the medical model entail? And in fact, I could say rather pejoratively when you said doctor knows best, it was in quotation marks, no offense, mom and dad.
Yeah.
So let's start with that. Can you explain to people what is the medical model of disability?
So the medical model of disability views disability as something that's inherently wrong with an individual. That an individual's difficulty navigating life and society is because of them and whatever conditions they have, whatever symptoms they experience. It's fully dependent upon the individual and very dependent on diagnoses and the medical profession, right? It's like you don't have a disability unless the doctor says you have a certain condition, and that condition is disabling.
And that condition also, there are parameters for what those conditions are based on the DSM-5 manual, correct?
Yeah, so I have, just for a little bit of background, I used to work, I'm currently in my last year of law school, and prior to going to law school, I worked for 5 years as a paralegal, doing Medicare, Medicaid, and home care, and for 4 years doing Social Security disability and supplemental security income applications and appeals, so I represented people at hearings with administrative law judges because their application for Social Security disability benefits had been denied. And so we were appealing them and trying to get them benefits. And so the Social Security model of disability, the way that you qualify to get benefits, I argued in my paper, is very dependent upon the medical model of disability, right? They use medical records. They don't care as much about your symptoms that you report to them verbally, unless it's supported by medical documentation.
So you also referenced, and you pointed out in your own writing, some of the problems with that model. You suggested you're critical of that model, and you offer two other ways of looking at the question of how can we even diagnose somebody as being disabled, and you make reference to the social model, social constructs of disability. Can you explain to the folks what that is?
So the social model of disability views disability as not existing because of the individual, but because of society and the way that society is structured, and how that individual's condition interacts with the environment, the procedures, the policies that are set up in the society around them. And emphasizes that the responsibility is actually upon society to be built accessible to all individuals, right? An individual who's in a wheelchair is not the only person who benefits from an elevator in the subway. Young mothers with a stroller, for example, or young parents with a stroller, someone with a suitcase who's on their way to the airport, right? We all benefit from things being more accessible, whether or not we ourselves have a disability. And so the social model of disability argues that it is incumbent upon society to rectify the inaccessibility of it.
That's fantastic. And for those of you who haven't driven around a mall and all the parking spaces are marked only for the disabled, and you say to yourself, "Boy, I got to walk an extra block." So the idea being that we have this responsibility. It's interesting as you were explaining that. I was also thinking about the Torah and the 36 times the mitzvah is mentioned to take care of the widow, the orphan, and the stranger, who are all at a disadvantage because of certain social constructs, economic and otherwise. So when you go into a social definition of disability, we're now talking primarily about shifting the responsibility from the individual who themselves may be disabled to a further awareness in society. Also, you point out that if we go by the medical model, right? So the responsibility is on the person who themselves is disabled. Why might it be difficult for somebody who's disabled to quote unquote prove through the medical model that they have a problem?
So one of the problems that I think exists with the medical model of disability is that it doesn't account for whether or not that person has access to health care in the first place, right? You have to have health insurance. If you have a job, you have to have paid time off or sick leave in order to be able to go to the doctor. You have to have the funds or means of transportation to get to the doctor. And if you can't leave your home independently, you have to have someone else who also has those accommodations, right? Who can go with you. And you also have to navigate the whole hurdle that is making sure your doctor accepts your health insurance, that the insurance will pay for whatever it is you need. If you are lower income, that makes that all the more difficult, right? You're probably working minimum wage, you probably don't have paid time off. And if you're talking about an individual with a disability who may have difficulty negotiating transportations, perhaps is dependent on paratransit that specifically takes that they had to apply for in the first place to get, right? That would take them to their medical appointment. That person has to be on time, there has to be good traffic, right? They're not in charge of their own transportation. So there are a number of barriers to accessing care that the medical model of disability does not accommodate for, and it also doesn't accommodate for physicians who may be overworked, underpaid, working under strenuous conditions, and may not have the luxury of documenting in a thorough and accurate manner what their patient is telling them, what signs and symptoms they're experiencing, because they have 15 minutes per patient and no breaks, right? And maybe they're already.
So the physician is also at a little bit of a disadvantage here, you're suggesting?
Yes.
Okay.
I received, a lot of my job was requesting medical records. And I had patients who had seen, for example, a psychiatrist for many years, and the way that psychiatrist kept records was on printer paper, handwritten, and there were a lot of loop-de-loops. And so this person, I think, had a very strong case based on their report of their symptoms, but their records are not so good, right? So what do you do when the records do not support the testimony of someone who you believe to be sincere? What's the judge going to do with that? They're not going to find them. Things like that happen, where you're like, this person clearly needs these benefits. They're not making this up. I believe them. Their testimony is clear, but if the medical documentation is not there to support it, you're out of luck.
Fantastic. So, not fantastic. So, next, not good, please, on record, fantastic. So, okay, so that's that's your social model. You also reference what's called the disability justice model. And therein, you make the claim that there are multiple systems that sometimes have to be navigated, which I think you were referencing, and that's impacted by intersectional identities. Can you tell people what an intersectional identity is and why that may affect me being classified as disabled?
So intersectionality is a term that was coined by Kimberly Crenshaw, who's a woman of color, and an academic and an advocate, to acknowledge how an individual is not just, for example, a woman is not just a woman is a woman and also a person of color. Or a man is a man who has schizophrenia, right? And also is maybe, right? So they're not just one aspect of their person and that defines them entirely, but there are multiple identities that we hold, that we walk through the world with, and that those multiple identities affect the way that we move through the world, right? If I'm a person with a disability and I'm also lower income, right, I'm going to have a harder time accessing care. I'm going to be treated differently when I go to the supermarket than a person who's not a person of color, a white person who goes to the supermarket and is wealthy and has no trouble and maybe isn't using dance, for example, when they purchase food, right? The way that we interact socially is different. It just is.
So let me ask you the following question, which people might have, which is, why should I care?
I think that's what it means to be human, is to have empathy for other people, right? If we want to be treated a certain way, we should care about how we treat other people, how other people are treated, because that reflects on our own character. And if we work for other individuals and care about other individuals, they in turn, theoretically, will care about us, right? But even if not, it makes the world a better place.
Put it in a Jewish, put that same idea into Jewish language.
Okay, yeah, I mean, so gemilut chasadim, deeds of loving kindness, tzedakah, justice and charity. You know, these are all terms that are so inherent to our Jewish tradition. Tikkun olam, repairing the world, right, is incumbent upon us. It is a mitzvah to repair the world, and we can repair the world in so many ways, right? Through our individual one-on-one interactions, to donating time or money based on our own circumstances, to signing a letter or a petition to a political leader. You know, there are so many ways that we can repair the world, and caring about other people, whether it's our immediate family or our extended family, or someone that we say hello to on the street, that we treat with kindness, that we look the waiter who's serving us and we look them in the eyes and say thank you when they come and refill our water glass. Little things help repair the world because they help restore each individual's life.
Beautiful, and obviously when we go out into the world, I think it's important to note that we not only represent ourselves, but we represent, as a Jewish people, we also represent Torah, and we represent Torah values, which is what you're framing for us, which is beautiful. So could you share with us, as you look back on the work that you've done in disability advocacy, what is an example of how would you frame your greatest success as you've been working in this field?
Greatest success. I think that my greatest accomplishment is when I was working as a paralegal. Over the course of those years, I helped around 60 individuals get benefits who otherwise would be receiving them, which I feel like is a major accomplishment. It is not easy to get Social Security benefits. The national average for getting benefits is like a 55% denial rate. You got a 45% odds of getting benefits. And at the initial application stage, it's more in the 30s. Probably, I think it's in the teens even at the reconsideration stage, which is if you apply and get denied, you have to be like, look at it again. And then they'll make it again, file it in time. And then if they're like, no, you're still not disabled, then you have to ask for a hearing. And then you have to have a judge who actually releases it.
So I have a vivid memory from when I was a youth in Toronto, Canada. And as you can see, if you want to take a look at the Jewish text regarding disabilities and inclusivity, that the third text there is a teaching from the Talmud that says one who sees people with disfigured faces or limbs recites a bracha. We actually recite a bracha. Now, isn't that sort of different than how we generally encounter people who are different than us? We say, blessed are you, Lord our God, sovereign of time and space, who makes people different, right? And I remember that there was one time that unfortunately a woman came into the synagogue and she was clearly paraplegic. And I remember back in the day, they had a bima that was much higher than the rest of the congregation. And I remember the clergy looking at her. It's a vivid, it's like it was yesterday. And just looking at her like this. And I thought, what a terrible way to greet people. How does a synagogue, what can a synagogue do to be more welcoming or more inclusive for people with disabilities?
I mean, I noted this to Gil when we were coming in, that I was so pleased that there was an elevator, because there are also obviously a lot of stairs, and I was like, that's great. This is something that I think about more consciously now, and that I'm more aware of, and making sure that everything is accessible physically is a really good starting, right? So if you have stairs at the entrance, to have a ramp also. You don't need to have it out all the time, but it's that you have it at least readily available nearby in case someone needs it in order to get in and get to the elevator. Things as simple as that. Making sure that emails that you're sending out, newsletters that you're sending out are accessible to someone who's using a screen reader. Making sure you have large print text available for Sidurim or Rachot is also really helpful. And I think that serving the community and reaching out to those who may not otherwise be available. Right? So if there's like a nursing home, for example, and individuals are not able to come to services in person, having them accessible on Zoom is also really lovely because it allows people to participate in events that they may not otherwise be able to physically attend.
So I'm going to ask you questions because I know a little bit about your background. So yes. So we went through this whole COVID thing, and because you referenced Zoom.
Yeah.
And I don't know how people feel about Zoom in general. There are those that claim that it was a terrible thing for the American synagogue, right? Because people who hadn't been coming have continued potentially not to show up. But you're referencing that it does give other people access. But I also know that you're a halakhic Jew and that you grew up in a traditional family. So how do you parse in your mind this idea of using Zoom for what you're saying?
I think that there's the idea of pikuach nefesh, of saving life in the Jewish tradition, which is one of the reasons that you're allowed to break Shabbat, is to save a life, right? Saving a life is not always literally mamash saving someone's life, it's like bleeding out or something, God forbid, right? Sometimes it is making sure that someone has community. Sometimes someone's survival, their mental health, is dependent on accessing their community. And by having Zoom, that opens up that community to them, right? There are people, we have relatives who live in DC, and are not able to travel to synagogue, but they attend Friday night services every Friday night, every week, online. And that's a beautiful thing, because even if they're not able to be physically present, they're able to participate in their Jewish community, and that helps their morale, that helps, helps them feel good and feel connected.
Okay, so you're very smart.
Yes.
And you mentioned to me earlier that your husband, Gil, Gil, he's the numbers guy in the family. So I love the concept of everything that you're speaking about, but I'm actually thinking Talmudically, and I would say, aim l'davar sofo, meaning that if I want to do what you suggest in a perfect world, then when is there ever an end point? How can we possibly, if I were to say this to you, how can we possibly afford, right, to accommodate all the different types of people that we're talking about, given that there's limited resources, whether it's in a synagogue institution or the community? Thoughts?
I think that there are certain things that are pretty low cost in terms of accommodating. I think that printing out pieces of paper in larger print font, not that expensive. You know, I think that Zoom, I don't know how much a subscription is, but it's like, you know, okay, so maybe we have like a bottle less of pedigree juice at a kiddish, but we can afford a ramp. Maybe we fundraise. Maybe we look at our budget and we think, where can we maybe pull some money together, right? I think that that's part of tzedakah, right? That's part of charity. Is making sure that our community is accessible to everyone who wants to be a part of it.
Fantastic. And even in this week's portion, which we just read in the Torah, Moshe himself refers to himself as Ariel Sfafan. He says, you know, I can't really speak in public, that he has his own disability that he's dealing with. So your visit with us is very timely. Tell me, where do you see yourself 5 years from now?
5 years from now, well, I can tell you that in the next few years, I'll be at Disability Rights Advocates, which is a nonprofit organization that brings large-scale lawsuits in order to increase accessibility and advance the civil rights of individuals with disabilities. So I'm going to be a fellow there for the next few years. And after that, I hope to be able to continue to work on larger scale change. I did a lot of direct service working with individuals and was very frustrated with the system as it existed. So God willing, I will be able to continue doing that sort of larger scale work that's rooted in the lived experience of individuals who are affected by those systems, as opposed to my own ideas of how it should be fixed.
So I want to thank you for sharing with us this Shabbat to allow us to increase our sensitivity, certainly our awareness. I think the buzzword that we hear in a lot of societal contexts is the idea of inclusion. And certainly your presentation today reminds us of the importance of including others. And I want to just point out the last sentence that we have here on the page. It says, the decency of a society is measured by how it cares for its least powerful members. And that's certainly something for us to think about as we continue our way through the book of Exodus. Sefer Shemot. Eliana Fisher, Toda Rabba, thank you very much for joining us.